Bar Association. My name is Karen Milton, and I'm a member of the New Lawyers Institute Committee. And I have the enviable task this evening to stand in for our chair, Lori Burke, unavoidable conflict and couldn't be with you tonight. She sends her regrets, but would be delighted at this turnout, as am I. So I was delighted, though, when Margot called me and asked if I would fill in for Lori and introduce our speaker tonight. Trying to remember a time in my professional career when I did not know Zach Carter. And I think I speak for everyone in the New York legal community when I say that we have been watching Zach's eminent legal career over these many years. So there are many things I can tell you about Zach Carter, and probably if you Googled him, you could know the same things. First, he's the 79th Corporation Counsel of the City of New York. That makes him the Chief Legal Officer for the City of New York, for its agencies and for its personnel. He oversees a law department of over 700 attorneys. They represent the city's interests in thousands of legal matters involving New York City, in both the local, state, and the federal courts. As the Corporation Counsel, I think he also functions a little as the mayor's consigliere, or maybe the conscience of the mayor might be a better description. Luca Brazia. Okay, we'll go with consigliere. In '93, then President Bill Clinton appointed Zach as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District. He was the first African American to fill this position. During his tenure, his office prosecuted the full range of federal criminal cases, including major narcotics, securities fraud, and human trafficking. As the U.S. Attorney, he also oversaw the civil rights prosecutions of New York City police officers charged with torturing Abner Louima and also rioters who killed Yankel Rosenbaum in the city's Crown Heights riots in 1991. He's practiced law as a partner in Whitney and Dorsey. He served as the United States Magistrate Judge for the Eastern District of New York and as a judge of the New York City Criminal Court. From 2002 through 2013, he chaired the Mayor's Committee on the Judiciary. He's the recipient of the Public Interest and Law Society Award from the Public Interest and Lawyers, and also the Emory Buckner Medal from the Federal Bar Council. But I think for tonight, most importantly, what I can tell you about Zach Carter, our 79th Corporation Counsel, is that he has been a loyal supporter of the New York City Bar Association, originally known as the Association of the Bar of the City of New York. I think it was that when we both joined. Giving away our age, Zach. And he has also been, most importantly in my view, a stalwart supporter of the New Lawyers Institute program from its inception 3 years ago. He has faithfully come every year to talk to a new group of new lawyers. And I think all I can tell you is that he understands and appreciates the importance of commitment to the profession, commitment to the next generation of lawyers, and the importance of renewing our profession with each generation of new lawyers. I think it's what he does best in his day job as the Corporation Counsel is he has 700 lawyers, many of whom are new lawyers, and he helps to groom them and to grow them and to make them committed members of our profession. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Zachary Carter.
How are you? Thank you. Good evening. I thought that I would take an opportunity to walk down memory lane and kind of tracing my meandering career so that maybe it will inspire some questions from you about your own career paths, because every lawyer's path is going to be slightly different depending on your interest, depending on your background and experience, and sometimes there's an element of good luck. I've certainly had plenty along the way, and the trick is to position yourself to take advantage of opportunities as they come up and to pursue opportunities that create other opportunities, that don't close off doors but kind of broaden your experience so that you can take advantage of new opportunities as they come. I certainly did not expect to have the career that I had when I entered NYU Law School. There was a good friend of mine who was an assistant U.S. attorney who I served with in the Eastern District of New York, named David Gould. David Gould was the son of an internationally renowned composer and conductor named Morton Gould, who was a contemporary of Leonard Bernstein and Aaron Copland, and just as importantly as his career as a conductor and composer, he invented and established BMI and ASCAP, which is the organization that registers and copyrights the music of artists so that they can get royalties, as a result of their creative works. So growing up in a family with that kind of, creative talent and being tone deaf, David did not think of himself as a particularly talented guy, even though he turned out to be a brilliant lawyer. And he was fond of saying that at the end of undergraduate school, he took an inventory of his talents, decided he had none, and went to law school. That was me. In high school, I majored in choral music. Don't ask me why. I mean, I have a very good ear and a very weak voice. I mean, I can carry a tune, but I haven't got much to carry it in. And I went to school at Cornell in the late 60s when there was a atmosphere of student activism over struggles in civil rights, and particularly with the assassination of Martin Luther King and the Vietnam War being in full swing, that occupied most of my attention and my energy. So while I did just well enough to make it into law school, I was something of a casual student and not necessarily prepared for the commitment that law school required. But fortunately, I got my sea legs eventually, found my footing, particularly when I got a job with the Juvenile Rights Division of Legal Aid as an intern, and got my first taste of courtroom work, and developed not necessarily a passion for trial work, even though it was something that kind of bordered on that. I think I enjoyed policy as much as I enjoyed the trial practice, but I certainly had a passion for serving the underserved. That's what was developed most from my experience in representing juveniles in family court. And then in my third year, I was in the NYU Criminal Law Clinic, in which I had an opportunity to actually handle preliminary hearings in criminal court in Manhattan, and combined with the trial work that I had done in family court, I had probably as much trial experience as many first-year associates did at law firms. And that was fortunate for me because, and again, sometimes it's good to have some luck along with whatever you've achieved through hard work. My criminal law professor, or one of my criminal law professors, was a friend of the then U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York, David Trager. And David Trager was a guy who was inclined to think outside the box in terms of trying to recruit legal talent to his office, and also, frankly, to diversify the ranks of assistant U.S. attorneys, and he had limited, if any, diversity at that time. Problem for me was that the office then had not a formal but a long-standing informal requirement of 3 years of experience at either a law firm or as a federal judicial clerk. And that's when I first, because of my own experience, started thinking about the notion of alternative measures of excellence. That was inspired in me by David Trager, who decided, when he sized up my experience, that he had been hiring young lawyers out of law firms who had had no hands-on experience in a courtroom. He had been hiring federal judicial clerks who had sat in courtrooms observing others but never practiced themselves. So why shouldn't he hire this kid who had had a substantial amount of hearing and trial experience? And so he did, took that chance, and it kind of worked out. So I started at the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office in December of '75. And by the time, and I was 26 years old then, by the time I was 29, I was the deputy chief of the criminal division. But that's because of the good fortune of starting right out of law school, and fortunately having some success at trial an investigation when I got there. And it was an extraordinary place to learn your craft. They had no choice but to entrust tremendous responsibility to attorneys at a fairly tender age, and much more responsibility than I would have gotten if I'd gone to any of the major law firms. I was trying felony criminal cases right out of the box, from counterfeiting, truck hijackings, bank robbery cases, narcotics cases, civil rights cases. So it was an extraordinary experience. It was all criminal, and I enjoyed it, but sometimes you have to have the right kind of mentor. And so David Traeger, who considered himself the guardian of my career, at a point where I'd been there for 5 years, said, it's really time you learn civil practice. And so he made some calls and arranged some interviews for me to interview at a couple of law firms. As I recall, it was Patterson, Belknap, and Mudge Rose at the time. And I ultimately chose to go to Patterson, Belknap, which was, and I did it, and it was a really calculating, mature decision that took into account the kinds of things that a young lawyer should take into account in deciding which law firm he should go to. This was 1980. There were no good restaurants downtown. There were only good restaurants in Midtown. Patterson Belknap was Midtown, so I chose Patterson Belknap. And there were some interesting partners at the firm at the time. Rudy Giuliani was a partner at the firm, who I did a lot of work with, as was Mike Mukasey, his current partner at another firm. The late Bob Patterson was at the firm, and Harold Tyler, who had been a high-ranking official at the Justice Department. And it was an office of really fine attorneys who had real hands-on experience as trial lawyers, and it was a fortunate opportunity for me because it was the uncommon law firm that, like a government office, would fight with clients to permit young lawyers to take on much more important responsibilities than they were normally entrusted with in law firms, because they had grown up in government service, and they knew that 26 and 27-year-olds could deliver if they had the ability and the drive. And so it was a great experience. I mean, I did a lot of First Amendment work. We represented the Daily News and the Wall Street Journal and Barron's and libel and defamation cases. Yes, Rudy was a champion of the First Amendment back in those days. Things changed, but I had the opportunity to do that. I had the opportunity to do some products liability work for the first time when I was at Patterson. But as much as I enjoyed it, my heart was still in public service. And after I'd been there for a couple of years, I got an invitation to join the executive staff of the Brooklyn District Attorney's Office. A Congresswoman, Elizabeth Holzman, who had gotten to some notoriety as a member of the Judiciary Committee involved in the impeachment proceedings against Nixon and Watergate. Had become elected the district attorney for Brooklyn, and was looking for an executive staff. And that's where another important part of my career story comes into play. How did I become known to Liz Holzman? Well, David Traeger, as I said, is the best kind of mentor. You don't have to call him up constantly to ask for advice. He calls you to tell you when there are opportunities. And one of the things that he told me that he thought was very important for my career and for my personal and professional development to become active in the city bar, at the time known as the Association of Bar of the City of New York, now the City Bar. And the most important aspect for me of City Bar membership is the opportunity to become active on its committees and subcommittees, because these subject matter committees produce reports that people pay attention to, that the legislature, both the city council, state legislature, even Congress and the Senate, pay attention when the city bar writes a report and expresses its view on weighing in favor or in opposition to proposed legislation. And the members of those committees put in a lot of work. They put in the same level of work in producing these reports that associates and partners put in representing private clients in law firms, or that government attorneys put in representing their state or federal or local interests. And what's important for young lawyers, and it gives you an opportunity to be exposed to lawyers outside of wherever you're working, and to impress them with your smarts and your industry and your capacity to write, to make reasoned arguments, to do research. And it gives you an opportunity to just meet people, to become better known. So I joined the City Bar, and I became a member of the Criminal Law Committee of the Bar Association. The chairman of the Criminal Law Committee was a guy named Peter Zimroth, who ultimately would become one of my predecessors as corporation counsel for the city of New York. In the Small World Department, Peter had been my first professor in criminal law at NYU Law School. So he was the chair of the committee. Also on that committee was a really fine lawyer, Bill Donino, who had been a counsel to Governor Rockefeller in criminal justice matters. Barbara Underwood, who was a tenured Yale professor and a specialist in criminal in criminal law and criminal procedure, and I believe Richard Lasky. And the other small world thing is that Peter Zimroth had become the chairman of Liz Holtzman's search committee for executive staff. And so all three of us became Liz Holtzman's executive staff, and that was solely due to the fact that we had been members of the criminal law committee of the city bar. So that is really, I think, really important, and I certainly strongly recommend to you that you become active, because it really, particularly the earliest stages of your career, can really make a difference in terms of your getting exposure. So I worked. I became one of the executive assistant DAs in Brooklyn, and was there for 5 years. I ultimately left there, and for a relatively short time, worked at the Office of Court Administration as executive assistant to the chief administrative judge for New York City courts. But then was appointed by Mayor Koch to be a criminal court judge, and served on the criminal court, I think, from 89 to I think 91. And then had the and I loved it. It was during the height of the crack epidemic. I was sitting in a very busy, what is called an all-purpose part in criminal court, and had, because of the crack epidemic and the volume, had 100 case calendars on average. I remember my record in an arraignment part was having 200 cases on one night court session, and loved it. But then I had the opportunity. I was recruited by the Board of Judges of the Eastern District to apply for a job as a U.S. magistrate judge, and I was torn because I loved the criminal court, the work I did in criminal court, and I loved the people I had an opportunity to serve. I mean, both the defendants and victims. But what I found, at least for criminal practice, is that the legal issues get to be, particularly when you're serving in criminal court, a bit redundant, even though the people are the people I cared about most. But in federal court, the legal issues are just off the charts, interesting and varied. And so that was kind of an irresistible opportunity, and so I took it. And it kind of pays to be in the right place at the right time, because now I'm sitting as a magistrate judge in the Eastern District of New York at a point where Bill Clinton is elected President of the United States, and they're looking for a new U.S. attorney for the Eastern District. I ultimately was nominated by, or recommended by then Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan to Clinton for appointment to the U.S. Attorney's position in the Eastern District. And I served in that position from 93 to 99, and it was an extraordinary opportunity. One of the first decisions I had the duty to make was whether or not to re-prosecute a young African-American man who had been acquitted in the stabbing of the murder of a young rabbinical student, Yankel Rosenbaum, during the course of Crown Heights riots in the early 90s. And made the decision that in order to vindicate the rights of anyone to be able to, to walk the streets without being assaulted because of their race or religion, that it was important to make the point that case should be prosecuted. And probably would not have brought the case if I thought that there had been a fair and full and competent presentation of the case in the state court. But because it was clear that his acquittal was due to not the greatest presentation of that case, I thought that justice demanded a retrial, so we prosecuted the case, and we were successful. And ultimately, we had the opportunity. There was a wide range of cases that get prosecuted in the U.S. Attorney's Office. It was an interesting intersection during the 90s of organized crime and securities fraud. Because there were these boiler room operations, most notably Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street. That was kind of the prototype of kind of fast-paced, fraudulent securities operations in which unwitting investors were invited to take bets in for very risky investment schemes, some of which had organized crime figures in the background, and so that occupied a lot of the office's attention. We had civil rights cases involving local jails and brutality in jails in Long Island. There were political corruption cases. Again, full panoply of narcotics cases, and so it was, and I had an extraordinary group of lawyers supporting all of those efforts. And after doing that for 6 years, I went into private practice and joined a Minneapolis firm, Dorsey and Whitney, that had a substantial New York office, and did that for, I can't believe, 14 years. Time flies. And then I got this unexpected opportunity to return to public service as in my current role as corporation counsel for the city of New York. I always thought that being U.S. attorney was the best job I was ever going to have, and this tops that. The variety is even broader than I encountered when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I mean, in effect, our office is the general counsel's office for the city. And the city is a major corporation that has as many varied legal challenges as any public corporation. We represent the police department when it's sued, corrections, fire, in both negligence suits, civil rights suits, but also just routine traffic accidents, because these are agencies that operate motor vehicles. We represent or provide some legal counsel to as you may have read, the housing authority. We represent agencies that are regulated by both state and federal regulatory agencies, and they have issues of compliance from time to time, and so we try to provide legal counsel to them in order for them to avoid to avoid problems that come from non-compliance with federal or state or local regulations. We have 16 separate operating divisions, ranging from tort to environmental law. I guess a couple of examples of just the sheer variety. I once had on my desk the 2008 regulations governing the testing of elephants for tuberculosis. Because when the circus comes to town, you got to know, right? I mean, it's remember when there was the summer that I referred to as our jiggle and fuzz phase in Times Square, and that was when all the tabloids couldn't resist having the topless desnudas along with the fuzzy characters, the cartoon characters who were becoming an annoyance to tourists in Times Square with their aggressive solicitations. And we spent, I can't tell you how many hours in meetings at City Hall we spent dealing with those issues, because some of these characters had become so aggressive that it was becoming a quality of life issue. But not an easy issue from a legal standpoint to address, because these cartoon characters, they weren't Rembrandt, they weren't Picasso, but they weren't Pavarotti, but they were artists, and they had a right within a fairly broad constitutional limits to sell their artistic services without undue interference. So we had to find ways that permitted them a fair amount of space to ply their trade, to be able to approach tourists and offer the opportunity to be photographed with them without them becoming a public nuisance that impeded pedestrian traffic. And so we ultimately we created mini zones that you may have observed in the pedestrian mall with these triangles that in which they are restricted to annoy tourists. So but the variety is endless, and it's really an extraordinary group of lawyers. I have to keep updating myself the number of lawyers. We're up to 900 lawyers now. But if you can believe it, I am constantly whining to Office of Management and Budget that we're understaffed. And we have 20,000 cases that are pending in state and federal court at any one time. So it is a huge undertaking, along with the other, the other legal services that we have to provide. So why don't I stop there for a moment and take whatever questions that you have about, you know, to the extent that my meanderings have provoked any thoughts about your own careers and how you might get yourself started. What a shy group. You're supposed to be, I thought this is lawyers? Come on. Somebody must have a question. Yes, ma'am. How are you? Right. It's interesting. The whole notion of having mentors is not something that existed when I first started in practice. I regarded David Traeger as a mentor kind of after the fact. I applied that label after the fact. He was just a guy who was my boss, who I could rely on for good, sound professional and personal advice in terms of managing my career. I think in part, the kind of people who will want to mentor you are people who've seen you put in the effort to perform and to improve yourself. I mean, these are basically, a mentor is somebody who's willing to adopt you, right? The kind of person who would be proud to kind of sponsor you and to talk about your capabilities to others, and particularly, and I don't think anything impresses a lawyer in a position to tout you to somebody else like just flat out hard work. You may, not everybody, because it is a competitive process in law school, is going to be on law review. Not everybody can finish, by definition, finish at the very top of their class, but it doesn't mean that there aren't very, very fine, capable lawyers who don't reach those achievements in law school, but in whatever job you manage to get upon graduation, if you give somebody at that aha moment, somebody who sees you and says, wow, this person is really performing better than I would have expected, that's the kind of person that wants to adopt you. So I think that's the way. I mean, the mentors I've had have been people who have grown, who kind of cared enough about my career to kind of reach out and be helpful. I wouldn't be shy. I wouldn't wait for them to come to you. I think that you have to find those opportunities to engage with them and ask them their advice on what options you should pursue going forward. Always be willing to go that extra mile and ask for assignments outside the areas that you've already worked, so you can kind of broaden your experience. I think people are always going to be impressed with that. Yeah.
So with the benefit of hindsight, what would you say are some important steps for those prepared for their first year shooting opportunities?
I guess it really you're always going to impress recruiters in law offices most when you can demonstrate that you have a real and not pretended interest in the area that you're pursuing. All right. If you say that you always wanted to be a criminal lawyer. I mean, you watch Perry Mason. I watched Law and Order. Oh God, and you had the opportunity to participate in a criminal law clinic and you didn't. People are scratching their head. Well, you went to this school. They had a criminal law clinic. You didn't participate. Well, can you at least explain that? You know. So if you are interested in a particular area and you have the opportunity to, take CLE in that area so that you're going to demonstrate that not only did you have a casual interest, but you actually did something to pursue it, to make yourself better in that area, that's going to make you more attractive. I think that I think that there are opportunities in public service to some extent are more abundant than they may be at the rarefied levels of private practice. Obviously you have to compromise in terms of compensation, but I think you more than make up for it in terms of fulfillment and job satisfaction. And also the opportunities to build your skills as a lawyer. I mean, the young lawyers in my office are certainly going to get to a courtroom faster than they would at a private law firm. But also, you also need to do the homework necessary to kind of find out where the opportunities are. I think people generally think of opportunities in law practice, in public service, as being kind of restricted to being an assistant DA, an assistant attorney general, an assistant corporation counsel. And the city employs thousands of lawyers. There are lawyers at agencies. There are lawyers at the Department of Education, Department of Corrections. What are there, about 300 or 400? You have to get a card from Stu Smith. He's in charge of recruitment for my office, and a really important member of our executive team. But how many lawyers would you say are at the Department of Education? About 300, 400? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're kind of our Pentagon. They're huge. So you have to, and really, I mean, there's so much exploration you can do online to get a sense of where the opportunities are. Yeah. Yes. I think to the extent that you have an opportunity through either this or other bar associations to do pro bono work, I think there are opportunities. Are there opportunities still here? I assume to provide pro bono service to struggling artists and small business. I would go online and look at to see what those opportunities are. Because I think they're important in terms of your own professional development, but it doesn't hurt that you can add those to your resume also. As experiences, as concrete experiences that you've had. More questions? Yes, ma'am. I didn't have an arrest. I had an indictment. Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Sure. No, I just didn't start back that far because I didn't want anybody to know how really old I was. That's one of the things about being a speaker at a young lawyers forum and to remind you how old you are when they invite you to speak. No, oh, no. No, I'm happy. I was very proud to participate in that. In spring of 1969, I was a freshman at Cornell, and this is in April, early April of '69. We learned that someone had burned a cross in front of the Black Women's Living Cooperative. The students there were, out of about 15,000 students, there were fewer than 100, African American students on campus, and we met at what was then the newly established Africana Studies and Research Center to decide how we would protest that event. And so, largely the upperclassmen who were the primary leadership, even though I'd been recently elected in the second semester as a vice president of the African American Society to be kind of a voice for the freshmen. There was a decision to have a peaceful sit-in at the Student Union, which was Willard Straight Hall. And this was intended to be a good old-fashioned early 60s type sit-in demonstration. So we march over at about 6 a.m. in the morning from the Africana Studies and Research Center over to Willard Straight Hall. This happened to be Parents' Weekend. So we had to evict some sleeping parents who were living who were staying in some of the, they had hotel rooms in the loft at Willard Straight Hall, and then we settled in for what was supposed to have been a peaceful demonstration. We kind of expected to have just a fine time there. I mean, we had, they used to have professional billiard tournaments at Willard Straight Hall, so they had this great billiard hall. We had probably about 6 months worth of food because it was the primary eating facility at Cornell. It was the Student Union. And then, because you have to remember that this was a very different time politically. It was a time when liberalism was ascendant, and conservative activism was just not a huge presence on campus, but there were pockets of conservatism, particularly among some of the jock fraternities. And one of those fraternities, Delta Epsilon, had some young men who decided they were going to take the building back by force. And so a number of them entered the building through a window. A fight ensued. They were ejected, not so gently. And that changed the atmosphere and became a very tense time. There were reports that threats had been lobbed in to the building, that they intended to come back and armed and take back the building by force once again. And we were 18 and 19-year-olds. And acting with the passion of 18 and 19-year-olds and the maturity, or lack thereof, of 18 and 19-year-olds. And we were living through a time when there was great admiration for a more strident and aggressive and revolutionary approach to the civil rights struggle, where the Black Panthers were a group that young people admired and wanted to imitate, and they were advocates of armed struggle. And there were some folks among the upperclassmen who, unbeknownst to most of us, had assembled some firearms. And so in the middle of the night, they brought in a bunch of rifles and shotguns into the building, which, as you can imagine, kind of raised the tension level. You can go online and look at some of the startling photographs, one of which was featured in then Life magazine and the other on the cover of Newsweek. I was in one of those photographs. We negotiated the end of the demonstration with the Cornell administration, which the leadership, both the president Perkins and the provost Dale Corson were frankly heroic figures in resolving that demonstration peacefully, interacting and respecting the legitimate concerns that were raised by the students in the building. At least one of them lost their job over it because they thought they should take a harder line. Because at the same time that Cornell resolved this demonstration peacefully with students on the other coast at San Francisco State, there were people who were seriously injured in demonstrations because the chancellor there, Hayakawa, under the influence of then Governor Ronald Reagan, took a far more aggressive stance, and it was with much more severe consequences for the students and for that community. But in any event, once we left the building and we marched out with, and those who had the guns prominently displayed, and again, this got featured. The district attorney conducted a grand jury investigation, and because we were all photographed and could be identified, there were many of us were charged with second-degree criminal trespass. All right, and the reason why, and that was the only thing they could charge us with, because the possession of rifles and shotguns on a state university campus was not illegal. And so we were asserting our NRA Second Amendment rights. Right? And if you look at McKinney's, you will see that as a result of the Willis Strait Hall takeover, and it's explicitly referenced in the firearms section, they made it illegal to possess a rifle or a shotgun on a state university campus. I think Trump would probably want to change that, but maybe not, because he'd be conflicted, because he does believe in the Second Amendment. I don't think he believes in black guys having a lot of guns on a campus. He might rethink that in light of some of his racial attitudes, huh? Yeah, right. I'm sure he would. But in any event, the charges were dropped because the university had no interest in pursuing that. And fortunately for me, the charges were dropped, because otherwise I wouldn't have gotten FBI security clearance that was needed for me to become an assistant U.S. attorney and other jobs I had there afterwards. But frankly, and frankly, it was a life lesson for me. I mean, I particularly since I survived it, I am grateful to have had, and all of and my classmates who I've discussed this with over the years, are really grateful to have had an opportunity to stand for something at some sacrifice to our personal futures for some greater cause. And I don't think people have always, I would want my daughter to have that opportunity. I wouldn't want her to do anything quite that dangerous. But I would want her to have the opportunity to take a stand and put some interest ahead of her own, because I think that level of commitment takes practice, and I think that very often you get timid advice from people who tell you to postpone that kind of commitment, and when you keep postponing it, you never get around to it. Wait till you get your job at the firm. Wait till you become partner. Wait till you become Uber partner. I mean, there's always an excuse for not taking a stand. Yeah.
I don't know if you'd be open to exploring this a little more, but
Oh, no, listen, we don't have to talk, if you don't want to talk about your legal futures, I'm good. No, in all seriousness, because it all tends to be related. I mean, so
No,
it's,
I
yeah,
think
yeah.
it is related. The
Mhm.
question is, how do you handle that uncertainty of with when you were beginning your search for a position and if it came up, how you dealt with that, because obviously it can
Right.
be awful.
Well, here's the one thing about the choice that, I kidded about, the way I chose to go to law school in terms of taking that inventory of talents. But what I also opted for, and I sometimes regretted it, but mostly not, was that when you're opting to go to law school, you're also opting for a level of security, right? Once you pass the bar and you are a member of the bar in good standing, you are going to eat. All right, you can practice law, from a Porta John in the middle of the Gobi Desert on a laptop, as long as you have your license to practice law and you have some training in the law. All right, so in terms of risk, we are in a fairly low risk profession. You're going to find opportunities. They may not pay as well as you'd like in the beginning, but you're going to find opportunities to learn your craft. And as long as you take on legal jobs in which you can learn skills and become exposed to other lawyers who may have the opportunity to steer you in a direction of opportunities that will help you grow even more in the profession and advance in the profession. We're in a profession where you're going to have opportunities as long as you put in the work. You're going to be fine. Now, because again, my career is certainly was not a straight line, but I was prepared for each new opportunity as it came along. Yeah.
It seems like you had different experience with different types of jobs. Have you ever considered going on your own, opening your own practice?
No. No, I never. It's and the thing is, and it's certainly not something I would. I envy people who have that yen. All right. I grew up in Washington D.C. Washington D.C. is a company town. Everybody works for the government. I always thought that I would grow up, work for the government, and get a steady paycheck. The only entrepreneurs in my family drove cabs. That was the level of entrepreneurship in my family, right? My wife, on the other hand, they owned a general store in Selma, Alabama, right? When they had the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they stopped at their diner to, the protesters, to fuel up. So she's used to, now that she's retired, from being a human resources executive, setting up a consultancy in the house and having her own business, she's comfortable with that. That's never been something that I've had a yen to do. But frankly, for those of you who do, I think it's liberating, But I think that you'd be wise to take a job, assuming it's available, with a firm, no matter how small, with somebody who can teach you the fundamentals of practice, right? Which you don't really learn in law school. You learn the building blocks, the scholarship. You learn how to research cases. But in terms of practice, you really do need some guidance. And then after you feel like you can stand on your own, hanging up a shingle and taking a shot at that's an option. That's an option. Yes. I mean, frankly, I guess the first place I'd go back to is the placement office at Fordham, because they're used to finding opportunities for international students who have LLMs. It's in their interest, their long-term interest to help, to support your success, because it's kind of hard to attract people to an LLM program and then, and not be able to tout their success. So that's, I mean, I don't have personal experience with that, though I think I have known some folks who've kind of had that dilemma. I had a friend who was at a firm that had a substantial international practice, and they had a number of lawyers who were European. Actually, at least one I know was a Dutch national, who was not admitted to practice in the United States, but he was admitted in the Netherlands, but had an LLM in the United States, and he was able to do transactional work that was useful to the firm. But I just, but I would start with the placement office at Fordham. I mean, are there other LLM students who you've had an opportunity to have discussions with about what they're doing and how they've
Well, that's what really worries me, is the fact that I am committed to public service in a different country and spent 10 years
Right.
serving those people from different republics of the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union
Right.
Empire.
Right.
And so I spent that time really rooted in that.
Right.
And I take all the experience that I have and take it here, because I am really committed to the underserved. Those LGBT community will
Right.
as well. Here I've learned from LLMs that they have the same type of dilemma, because they come out into the workforce and they lose out on all the jobs that other people get who have not, who have had a really 3-year law school program and come out from, whether it be NYU or whether it be Fordham,
Right.
but not LLMs.
And what I don't know, and perhaps Stuart does, what the rules of the road are for getting admitted when you've been admitted in a foreign country. I mean, do you have any idea?
Yes.
Admitted and you are British citizen, then admitted is easy.
Yes.
Job hunting is
Yes.
Right.
So,
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Any other? Yes.
Tell us a little bit more about
Stu, how do we?
Sure. I assume everyone here has graduated, yes? Okay. So we have a new, relatively new rule. You have to apply online through the cities.org, and it's very helpful. As Zach says, there are hundreds and hundreds of attorneys who work for the city internet agencies. There are probably 50, 60 agencies in the city that have one council. All of them have a legal staff, just both in services as
as long as it's a legal job. It's a legal job. Yes.
The majority of your public career you focus on criminal, and then now you work for public cases. Could you explain how, in this part of your public career, how that's changed more than just criminal law to all the
Well, I think that what prepared me most for this job, for the substantive legal issues in this job, was my experiences in private practice. All right, because so I spent 14 years as a partner at a major law firm with very little criminal work as part of that. I mean, I did a lot of products liability work and asbestos. I tried a long civil securities fraud trial. Did some white collar criminal practice and some internal investigations and a lot of compliance work, counseling companies who were under investigation and who needed to establish compliance, operations in their companies. But that's where I kind of got a broader civil experience that is helpful in this job. The front end of my career was decidedly criminal specialized, but in the latter half of it was frankly mostly civil.
Tell us the story of something new that you learned
On working for the city? Oh, it's even though I spent the better part of my career in public service, this is the first time I've actually worked in the seat of government. All right, so when I was U.S. Attorney, it's an important position, but it is removed from the seat of federal government. I didn't have interactions with the President of the United States when I was U.S. Attorney, and I had relatively frequent contact with the Attorney General of the United States at the time, Janet Reno, but primarily because I was on her advisory committee of U.S. attorneys, not because in the ordinary course I would. In this job, part of my job is advising the mayor directly on legal issues, and so I spend a lot of time in meetings in which we're sculling through policy issues that have legal challenges in dealing with the homeless. As much as we would love to be able to take people off the streets who are obviously in distress, if they're not severely mentally ill, they have a right of self-determination that the Constitution recognizes. So we can't force them off the street and into services if we don't. So we have to find ways to persuade them to take advantage of the services that are available. We also have to prepare ourselves to make the case that when a person is severely mentally ill, particularly when the weather is dangerously cold, that we have built up enough of a legal and medical case that we can establish that this is a person who is clearly a danger to themselves and not in a position to make decisions for themselves. So that is part of the challenge of what we as lawyers in the law department have to deal with in terms of advising the mayor directly on those kinds of issues. In terms of affordable housing, trying to find affordable housing in the most expensive housing market in the world, right? We can't make it happen magically. As much as a liberal administration would like favors as a matter of philosophy, income redistribution, there are constitutional limits to the extent to which you can do that. I mean, there are takings clause limitations, and should be. It should be difficult to take somebody's property without due process. there are times when we want to use devices that blunt the effects of gentrification by providing community preferences. And so a tool that would permit longtime residents of communities that are looking at gentrification to stay in communities that are now finally becoming improved. Unfortunately, those same devices have been used to exclude people in the past. So how do you weigh that, right? And these are very thorny issues that I didn't have to deal with as U.S. Attorney because I wasn't involved in the seat of policy making, and that's what makes this job fascinating. It's like getting a free PhD in political science. Anybody else? Okay.
That's all right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
You're with us. All right, thanks everybody for coming.
Okay.
It's good. It's good.
How are you? How are you? Oh,